good. How are you?
Fine. Everyone, Chris Errett's second lecture is today at 4 o'clock. I'm sure Chris was going to announce that. It's at the Center for African Studies. I hope you, I mean, it was so full of surprises for both of us. Before first or second was for the African continent. And he's such a great scholar. So I hope you all could come. And immediately after this, we're having our photograph where? Over at
Cooper Gallery.
over in the cold, freezing
Yes, sorry.
of Cooper Gallery?
Yes.
Not in the warm, right out there?
But you wanted over at the cold freezing Cooper Gallery.
I know, yes, I know. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody over.
Well, welcome. I don't have to do this one. Okay. So next week's colloquium will be delivered by Rumbi Katesta, and she'll speak on the rise and representation of independent female voices in Zimbabwean politics. It's a documentary project that she's been working on, and we're very excited about that. So today I'm very happy to introduce Traci Parker. She's assistant professor at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I understand that Traci Parker is a popular professor, considered to be very rigorous, while also dispensing a wealth of knowledge. She offers such innovative classes as buying and selling of blackness and race and gender at the movies, in addition to more standard fare, such as the history of the civil rights movement. Previous to joining the faculty of UMass Amherst, she was the Provost Career Enhancement Postdoctoral Scholar in the Department of History at the University of Chicago, where in 2013 she earned her PhD in history. Okay, so Traci is the author of Department Stores and the Black Freedom Struggle, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s. And this was published just this year by the University of North Carolina Press. She's also co-author with Dr. Marsha Walker McWilliams of the Civil Rights Reader, which is under contract by the University of Massachusetts Press. She continues to publish widely, contributing book chapters and essays to such important journals as the American Historian, Journal of Women's History, Feminist Studies, and the Journal of African American History. Now, while at the Hutchins Center, she'll be at work on her new book project, Beyond Loving, Sex, Love, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement, which examines intraracial love, sex, and marriage among African American activists in the civil rights and Black Power movements. The recipient of numerous honors, she has received an NEH Fellowship and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation's Nancy Weiss Malkiel Jr. Faculty Fellowship, among other awards. So please welcome Traci Parker as she presents her colloquium talk.
Thank you. Krishna, you did do research for that one, because I didn't expect the student comments. I want to before...
A dispenser of a wealth of dollars, is that it?
That's exactly right.
I'm going to put that on my CV.
Before I begin, I want to thank the Hutchins Center, specifically Skip Gates and Krishna and Abby and Velma. They've been so supportive and generous. It is, as a scholar, it's important to have the time to sit and write, and so it is just, I can't thank them enough for this opportunity. I also want to have a quick caveat. This is a really new project. I owe my other publisher a book next week. And the other one just came out earlier this year. So I am furiously researching and gathering information. And so what I'm presenting today is my initial thoughts and arguments that I believe is going to be part of the central themes of the book, but also to give you a sense of the cast of characters who are going to be featured prominently in the book. This project is also very personal. My husband's parents met in the Black Panther movement. My mother-in-law never considered herself to be a card-carrying Black Panther because she didn't believe in communal living. His father, on the other hand, was part of the Black Panther Party and was a member of the Chicago and Rockford Black Panther Party and would work with both chapters. And they met on a prison bus This sounds weird. They met on a prison bus where she was volunteering, and it was a prison bus that was sponsored by the Black Panthers, and she was going to visit a friend of hers' brother. And she would do this often. And it was on the prison bus that she would take these trips where she met Charles Lewis, and they would have these conversations and they fell in love. So she didn't like the gender politics of the Black Panther Party, so this became a thing that they had to work out in their marriage. And I'm still trying to get all the juicy details, but their love has inspired, they're no longer married, I should say that, but their love and their divorce have inspired a lot of the material in this book. And also, before I begin, I want to say that there is some discussion of sexual violence and sexual assault and domestic violence. And so the trigger will be, there will be an image of Fannie Lou Hamer. So if you need be, I'm going to be talking about sexual violence then. And then when I switch to a slide of James Foreman and his wife, we are done that part of the talk, and we'll be just speaking mostly about marriage. So I just wanted to let folks know. In the fall of 1961, almost 2 years after meeting in the Nashville sit-in movement, civil rights leader Diane Nash and James Bevel, seen here, secretly married in a civil ceremony in Mississippi. Emblematic of romantic relationships forged on the battlegrounds of the civil rights movement, theirs had been a courtship without a real courtship. The civil rights movement being the force which pulled these young people together and held them together. Diane and James had been thrown together in the most highly charged atmosphere imaginable. Each day, they had focused all their energy in the most single-minded way on the good of the cause. They shared the same friends, the same enemies, the same fears. There was a singular intensity to life every day for both of them. For life was always lived on the edge, and the dangers, including prison and, of course, death, were considerable. Their union, however, surprised nearly everyone in the movement. See, Diane Nash, as you can see here, was not only beautiful, but she was also smart. She had attended Fisk University for some time before quitting to join the movement. She was the runner-up in a Chicago Miss America contest, and according to Jet magazine, a publication which famously chronicled the civil rights movement, she was, quote, member of the brain trust that made the Freedom Rides a well-coordinated operation. Bevel, on the other hand, was, quote, unbending, eccentric in his opinions as to almost seem deliberately abrasive, and according to many of his comrades, was, quote, not very good-looking or particularly tall. But what Bevel lacked in looks, he made up for in charisma, a characteristic that proved particularly useful in attracting women. For all intents and purposes, Bevel was a womanizer. Nash and Bevel's passion for each other was inextricably tied to their passion for the movement. Once married, the Bevels remained in Mississippi, traveling the state, meeting with Black folks and encouraging them to seek change. They taught the techniques of nonviolent protest to high school students, and they worked on voting rights initiatives not only in the Magnolia State, but also in North Carolina and Alabama. In fact, their activism contributed to the birth of the Selma to Montgomery marches and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By 1965, after a few years of marriage, Nash and Bevel's relationship had declined. Bevel was an incessant philanderer and physically abusive. That March, Diane filed for separation and moved back to her hometown of Chicago with their 2 young children. 3 years later, they divorced. Later in his life, Bevel would admit to having 16 children, only 2 of which were from his relationship with Diane Nash. The Nash-Bevel marriage captured Black America's attention in the mid-20th century. In 1963, Jet featured the Bevels in a spread titled, Freedom-Fighting Family Embarked on a Mission of Love. And when Nash petitioned for legal separation in the Birmingham's Chancery Court in 1965, the magazine printed in searing red font, Bevel hits wife, blames racist. Jet continued to feature the couple until their divorce. Approximately 10 years ago, their marriage and divorce once again made headlines when Bevel was convicted for incest. Generally, however, interracial romances among African Americans in the civil rights movement, with of course the notable exception of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, have received little scholarly attention. And even in the case of the Kings, the focus has overwhelmingly remained on his infidelities. not what Coretta herself called, quote, a collaborative partnership. Instead, scholars have been fixated on romantic relationships between white women and black men in the civil rights movement, and the US Supreme Court decision to outlaw anti-miscegenation laws in Loving v. Virginia. In the 1950s and 1960s, when young black and white activists flooded the American South to challenge racial discrimination and segregation, white segregationists resistant to their efforts clamored that the civil rights movement encourage widespread sexual debauchery across the color line. Interracial sex had been a fear that had driven white Southerners into a state of frenzy for most of their history. They irrationally feared that offspring produced by a white woman and a black man would taint the purity of whiteness and therefore undermine white supremacy. What has been lost then is a thorough appreciation of interracial romances among African Americans. These relationships far outnumbered those between white women and black men. My current book project explores African American romances in the civil rights and black power movement. It argues that because gender and Jim Crow were intricately intertwined in deeply pathological ways, black romantic relationships became sites for confronting racism and gender and sexual inequalities. These relationships, casual and committed, as well as heterosexual and homosexual, were informed by these movements, and these relationships also informed changing ideas of gender and sexuality, family and community, and activism in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. In other words, black activists whose radical ideas were forming and shaping the black freedom movement also explored unconventional ideas related to the structure of their romantic relationship in ways that sought to advance the individual and the race. Beyond Loving, am thinking that I'll tell it in 5 to 6 chapters, but just to give you a sense of like the major topics that I'll hit, just so you know where this particular talk is situated, is that it's going to start with an examination of older relationships of the civil rights movement older generation. So I'm talking about Rosa Parks and her husband, Ella Baker and her marriage, Martin Luther King and his wife, and Coretta. I then hope to proceed and talk about sex and marriage among youth leaders with the sense that these relationships fostered egalitarianism, offered physical and psychological relief from racial terror and violence, but also bred racial and gender conflicts. Children and their experiences raised in the movement, on the movement's battlegrounds, will be examined next. The book will conclude with an examination of divorce, single parenting, and remarriage. I also hope to spend some time in this book looking at the ramifications of these mid-century couplings for subsequent generations, including members of the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, however, I will focus on sex and marriage as battlegrounds of the Black freedom struggle in the American South, from the Freedom Rides in 1961 through Freedom Summer in 1964. I will conclude briefly with a discussion on Black Power movement marriages. This is a new avenue that I've been looking at recently. And I should add that by marriage, what I mean is what this institution meant at this historical moment, right? In that it was religious, legal, and heteronormative. Before I proceed, however, I want to provide some background on the Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer, as it's important to understand what activists were fighting for and the space they occupied. The Freedom Rides was sponsored by the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Congress of Racial Equality, better known as CORE. This campaign challenged the non-enforcement of US Supreme Court decisions in Morgan v. Virginia in 1946 and Boydston v. Virginia in 1960. These cases respectively outlawed racial segregation on interstate buses and bus terminals. The Freedom Rides left Washington, D.C. on May 4, 1961, and was scheduled to arrive in New Orleans on May 17th. Black and white riders rode together, oftentimes with whites in the back of the bus and blacks in the front of the bus. On stops, whites would go to the black waiting room, while blacks went to the white waiting room. As you can imagine, by the time they reached the Deep South, they were met with violent resistance. In Birmingham and Anniston, Alabama, buses were firebombed, riders were viciously beat with baseball bats, iron pipes, and bicycle chains by the Ku Klux Klan and the local police. Riders failed to reach New Orleans, and CORE abandoned the movement. Diane Nash, however, believed that the rides must continue and organized a movement of members from the Nashville branch of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. She arranged for them to board buses in Birmingham and head to New Orleans on May 17th. The Freedom Rides would continue for the remainder of 1961 and eventually force the Interstate Commerce Commission and the John F. Kennedy administration to enforce the two aforementioned anti-discrimination rulings. 3 years later, in June 1964, Freedom Summer occurred. Freedom Summer is also known as the Mississippi Summer Project. It was spearheaded by Robert Moses of SNCC and the Council of Federated Organizations, which was a coalition of Mississippi branches of SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, and the Southern Christian Leadership Alliance Conference. Freedom Summer was a political and community initiative that aimed to increase Black voter registration and the number of African Americans at the polls in the Magnolia State. The Summer Project organized the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as a non-exclusionary rival to the white segregationist Mississippi Democratic Party, established freedom schools, a network of 30 to 40 voluntary summer schools that was an alternative to the state's segregated and underfunded public schools for African Americans, and it founded 50 freedom libraries that provided library services and literary guidance for African Americans, many of whom who had never entered a library. Sex and marriage, not so much dating, is pretty well documented in existing historical records. Both were weapons used to keep African Americans in submission. It is no wonder then that, as one scholar has argued, quote, in the civil rights movement, sex was especially sensitive and a charged issue. The sight of young white women fraternizing with blacks infuriated many white Southerners and also perhaps piqued their sexual fantasies. Southern white segregationists responded to the civil rights challenges in sexualized ways. This is Fannie Lou Hamer, just if you feel like you need to leave. Fannie Lou Hamer famously spoke out against sexual violence in Southern jails. Before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention on August 22, 1964, Hamer testified that upon her return from a voter registration workshop in Winona, Mississippi, she was arrested. While in jail, she detailed, I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by the orders of the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. I laid on my face and the first Negro began to beat. I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at the time on my left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat me until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat me, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro, who had beat me, to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in the head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. All of this on account of we want to register, to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America? The land of the free, the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Hamer's experience was far from an anomaly. Female inmates, recall James Farmer, were, quote, given a vaginal search by female guards using the same rubber-gloved finger without washing in between searches. Both Farmer and Stokely Carmichael remembered male freedom riders fearing their imprisoned girlfriends would be raped. In his 1964 book about SNCC, Howard Zenn recorded instances in which the police attacked pregnant women, causing a miscarriage in one. In another, Bessie Turner, a teenager from Clarksdale, Mississippi, was arrested in January 1962 and forced to endure flogging between her legs. Black men also were sexually harassed and violated. Prison officials often forced male inmates awaiting transportation to Parchman Prison to stand naked while onlookers stared at them. Lawrence Guygot, director of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, remembered that when he came to the Winona jail to inquire about Hamer and the other women who had been arrested, he was arrested, forced to take off his pants. The officers then threatened his testicles with burning sticks. The relationship between sex and the civil rights movement, however, was more than this. In the 1960s, with the sexual revolution in full swing, activists forged bonds in meetings, on the front lines of protest, at parties or local nightclubs, and these relationships often translated into love and sex. These encounters had a feverish intensity which was only enhanced by the aphrodisiacs of excitement and danger. Many fell under its spell, including young women who had been brought up with the idea that sex should be saved for marriage. SNCC staffer Jean Wheeler Smith once said, quote, "There was a lot of sex in SNCC. We were 20 years old. What did you expect?" African American male leaders in particular were revered. They were sought after like celebrities. SNCC organizer Dion Diamond said this meant that he, among others, had, quote, "instant access to sex, unabated sex. And I think if there was 100 black civil rights workers, I would dare say that 99 took advantage of it." Sex, however, was not simply about physical attraction or raging adolescent hormones. Many engaged in sexual relations looking for comfort and relief, albeit temporary, from the perils of white supremacy and violence. Charles Jones recalled, quote, "Sex, enjoying each other's affection, both touching and sexual involvement, was a way of reassuring each other that we were going to be okay. It wasn't a question of long-term commitment, it was a question of mutual need that members of the movement themselves shared with each other." Bob Yancey agreed, quote, "Relationships may have happened as much out of stress as anything else." Many of these relationships, however, did not last once the couple left SNCC. When the stress of the movement was no longer present, people were unable to relate to each other in a normal way. Sex also was used as a form of domination and control. A number of SNCC men engaged in what Charles Jones called sexual power games. Some were sexually aggressive, trying to get in bed with every woman, black and white, they could find, said one white SNCC worker. Annie Pearl Avery, a black activist from Alabama, got so tired of the unwanted advances from her male coworkers that she put out word at a SNCC conference in Atlanta, quote, "Anybody that comes to my door and tries to come in here without permission, I'm going to hurt you." Since Avery was known to tote a gun on occasion, the warning had a strong effect. Many African American women in SNCC struggled with balancing dating and their movement commitments. Historian Cynthia Fleming writes, "Those with leadership responsibilities often felt the need to cultivate a tough, assertive image. Some were convinced that dating a SNCC man could compromise that image and ultimately diminish their effectiveness." One black female activist commented, quote, "Probably if you look at our personal lives, we've probably had a very different personal life in terms of relations. Many of us made the decision not to go with SNCC men because in some ways we didn't need to be fucked. It was very confusing. Here by fuck she means something more than sex. She means to be abused or taken advantage of. Women found it tough, in short, to be tough and vulnerable at the same time." Before I move on to black marriages, I want to briefly mention interracial sex and its impact in the civil rights movement. Here is James Foreman and his future wife, Dinky Romley. And he's actually, based on what I've seen so far, one of actually the few top leaders of the civil rights movement who went ahead and married a white woman. Many of them married a white woman maybe on their second or third marriage. But their first marriage, many of them married black women. Anti-miscegenation laws were the very foundation of segregation and the last piece of the Jim Crow to fall. According to the historian Jane Daly, in the mid-20th century, every civil rights worker was vulnerable to charges of sexual degeneracy, licentiousness, a wicked desire to destroy the white race through interbreeding, and of course, communism. Still, many civil rights activists across the color line in their romances. White men with black women, and more often black men with white women, in the years preceding the Loving ruling. Reflecting on her romance with a black man, former SNCC activist Penny Patch has written, quote, "We were young, we were living in wartime conditions. We were always afraid, we never knew whether we would see each other again. We were ready, black and white, to break all taboos. SNCC men were handsome, they were brilliant, they were brave, and I was very much in love." Jewish activist Elaine DeLotte Baker once recalled, quote, "They needed something and we needed something. It was not okay to trust each other, but the power of the need to be understood, to communicate, and to challenge authority was very strong. For some, however, interracial sex was not only about love and physical connections. It was also about a decisive denunciation of Jim Crow and the ultimate expression of the type of social and political revolution that civil rights activists hoped to help spark. According to activist Casey Hayden, some white women viewed their relationships with black men as a testament that they were colorblind, while black men viewed crossing the color line as a form of liberation, a reclamation of their manhood in the Jim Crow South. Interracial romances, however, had their limits. First, given the 3-year century history of white men sexually assaulting and raping black women without fear of reprisal, crossing the color line did not evoke the same sense of liberation for African American women. Second, as much as they could foster unity and some degree of egalitarianism, these relationships also bred strife and conflict. Interracial romances, some believe, were threats to the movement and eventually caused the expulsion of whites from SNCC in 1966. Gloria Wade Gales recalled, quote, "We were especially naive about the impact of romantic alliances would have on the movement. When romantic alliances between black men and white women became almost as common as cotton, we lost the harmony with which we once sung, 'We shall overcome.'" Black women, one African-American female activist in SNCC commented, quote, "We felt neglected because the white girls got all the attention." Also, white women who for the first time in their lives were forming friendships and intimate relationships with black men found it difficult, if not impossible, to keep those relationships secret. This placed black men at a great risk for reprisal and worsening racial and gender conflicts within the movement. Most black men kept their relationships with white women a secret, going so far as to not acknowledge them in public and demeaning their sexual partners. Romances cultivated on the battlegrounds of the civil rights movement were often short-lived, and that included movement marriages. It might be a surprise that at the height of the sexual revolution and away from home for the first time, 20-somethings chose to marry. But these young activists understood that opponents of the movement would use any sign of sexual transgression and gender nonconformity to label African Americans unfit for citizenship. Therefore, respectability politics shaped the way civil rights activists represented black womanhood and manhood. In other words, some activists pursued marriage in part with the hope that being part of this institution would prove that African Americans were deserving of first-class citizenship. Now, I want to go back real quick. I was reading James Bevel and Diane Nash were once talking about how they met and how they fell in love. They have two different stories. Diane Nash says something that's very romantic. They were working on the front lines, they fell in love, it was bound to happen. James Bevel said he was looking for a partner, and she was there. And so I want to add that sometimes marriage may have been simply about companionship. The line of thinking, though, about the connection between marriage and citizenship is not new. Marriage had long been linked to citizenship and civil rights. In her prolific study on slave and free black marriages, historian Tara Hunter reveals that marriage was a crucial site for racial struggle in the 19th century. During slavery, blacks were barred from getting married. Once free, however, they were punished if they did not marry while cohabitating. She writes, quote, "Marriage was identified and trumpeted as the key to the realization of full citizenship, the means by which African Americans once and forever be accepted as capable and worthy people." By the 20th century, marriage was nearly universal for adult African Americans, yet it continued to be viewed as a means of realizing and showcasing respectability and a route to advancing the race. Increasingly, however, the individual harmony of participants gained newfound importance. The historian Anastasia Curwood argues that in the 1920s and 1930s, men and women began to question the idea of selflessness in marriage. The satisfaction of the individual, economically, emotionally, and sexually, became more important to Americans in general, including African Americans. Migration, new urban centers of black life, an explosion of new forms of popular culture, and changing gender roles all worked to reshape how African Americans thought about marital relations. The civil rights movement added a new layer of complexity in the 1950s and 60s. Young activists like Diane Nash and James Bevel obeyed some aspects of gender normative marriage, but also sought to create relationships that met their ideas of liberation and realities of working and living on the movement's battlegrounds. In a large number of movement marriages, the movement became the only thing that was real. Their real families were composed of their closest friends in the movement. Their other families had become momentarily, at least, secondary and distant. The only thing they talked about, read about, was what happened that day in the movement. They did not judge each other on how good or complete the other person was on a normal scale of mating for young Americans. They judged each other on how good each other was to the movement. Take, for example, Robert Moses and Donna Richards. In late 1963, while working with SNCC's Tougaloo work-study program, Moses, the initiative's mastermind, and Donna Richards, its co-director, fell in love. Within a few months and during Freedom Summer, Moses and Richards married. According to Moses' biographer, although they had sharp public disagreements at SNCC meetings, privately their relationship had been proceeding at a quick pace, as did most relationships in SNCC, probably as a side effect of the intense and volatile conditions under which many lived. So it's perhaps not surprising that although they had been dating for a very short time, the two married while in New York. Upon the news of their union, Dr. Martin Luther King wired the couple, wishing them a happy and long life and calling their movement contributions an inspiration to generations yet unborn. 2 years later, however, in 1966, their marriage dissolved. The Moses-Richards marriage was difficult from the start. Even before they married, Moses was frequently on the road visiting other SNCC projects, as well as politicians in Washington, D.C. When they married and SNCC staffers learned about their union, Richards was almost ostracized. A relative newcomer to the organization, Richards had managed to attract and marry the quietly charismatic head of the Mississippi campaign, to whom many other women had been attracted, and according to Julian Bond, wanted to marry. But the jealousy was not always rooted in romantic attraction. Dory Ladner explained, quote, "The marriage made us angry because we had had Bob all to ourselves. He was like my big brother. We didn't want to share him." Dave Dennis agreed. They thought, quote, "They thought they had some part of Bob. In Mississippi, males and females did. People felt that she had come in and taken Bob away." Bond and Dennis also revealed that many feared that as a result of the marriage, Richards would gain extra status and a bigger role in meetings and disrupt the group-centered leadership of SNCC. Making matters worse, the fiercely independent Richards chose not to take Moses' name, a very uncommon decision in the 1960s. Her decision, however, does not appear to bother Moses, a man Julian Bond once described as, quote, "someone who approached gender roles more sensitively than Martin Luther King, if not perfectly free of gender bias." I don't know how that could possibly be true, but sure. It did, however, anger and confuse some SNCC members. One black woman commented, quote, "I think it's really disrespectful." Penny Patch recalls it being her first feminist glimmering. She pondered why Richards was doing that, and she said, quote, "That's kind of neat." Being married in the movement also meant that Moses and Richards had little privacy. Their first home in Hattiesburg, Mississippi functioned as an extension of the SNCC offices. As a result, growing their family proved difficult, as the organization, Moses rightly observed, could never evolve in a way to accommodate those demands. When Moses and Richards tried to build a home and family life, folks often complained that they had, quote, "isolated themselves." According to Dave Dennis, he once came to the couple's second home in Jackson to discuss movement business, and he was, quote, "sent to the porch because Donna didn't want to have the movement come into her house. So I left. I wasn't going to sit out there." The Moses-Richards marriage was as intense and volatile as life in SNCC itself. When the organization began to falter, it became increasingly difficult for the two to ignore the ever-present differences within their own unions. In the fall of 1964, while Moses and Richards were visiting Africa as a member of the SNCC delegation, their vision on the purpose of the Black freedom struggle split. During their visit, President Toure advised the SNCC workers to hold on to your resources and develop your people. Moses received this message as an affirmation to continue grassroots organizing. Richards, on the other hand, believed that Toure was encouraging SNCC to embrace Pan-Africanism and create an African bureau. Richards and Moses also split on anti-war participation. Unlike Moses, Richards did not endorse the idea that SNCC officially should take a position on the nation's involvement in the Vietnam War. because she feared it would lead to additional charges of community infiltration within the organization and cripple efforts to raise funds. Things only got worse when, upon returning from Ghana in 1966, Richards decides to organize an all-black conference called Roots in New Orleans. While she's organizing the conference, she falls in love with Rudy Lombard. Moses becomes aware of this and he's not quite sure what to do. And so he spends the next few years or next several months grappling with what's going to be the future of his marriage. However, it's when he's drafted into the Vietnam War that he decides that he's going to leave along with 30,000 other, not just 30, people who fled the United States to dodge the draft. During this time, though, he has the time to think, and he notes that it had become apparent that his marriage to Richards could not be saved. Any lingering doubts about their relationship ended 1 year later, when he snuck back into the United States to check on Donna to see how she was doing. This would be the last time they saw each other. The linchpin of the SNCC operation, Ruby Doris Smith, seen right here in the middle, also married on the battlegrounds of the Civil Rights Movement. In late 1963, while recovering from surgery at her sister's home, Smith's brother-in-law's friend, Clifford Robinson, visited the home and was introduced to Ruby. Sparks were said to immediately fly. By the end of that year, Smith and Robinson had quietly eloped. According to Smith's biographer, some were surprised that Ruby was married at all, and even more surprised that her new husband was not involved in the Civil Rights Movement. Some of this was due to folks thinking that Smith didn't date at all, but she did, like so many black women, and when she did so secretly. She understood that the romance could undermine her leadership. Her husband, however, didn't remain an outsider for long. In 1964, he became the mechanic of the SNCC staff, working on the cars of the Sojourner motor fleet, which his wife administered. Bob Zellner thought that Ruby and Clifford made a good team, since Clifford took care of the cars and Ruby Doris cared for SNCC members' souls. When Robinson married, he also married the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because it was such a large part of Ruby Doris's identity, was inextricably bound in SNCC by this time. The couple adored each other, but they had differing ideas on gender roles. Emma Bell Moses, one of Smith's movement colleagues, revealed, quote, "I think the root cause of their problems was that she spent a great deal of time away from her husband, and he wasn't that involved in the movement." Gwen Robinson also noted, I can remember, you'd run into the office, he's standing there waiting on her to go, and everyone's saying, Ruby Doris, so-and-so and so, and he's saying, look, we gotta go. And she's saying, Cliff, wait a minute, I gotta take care of this. And him stalking off mad, and she's saying, oh God, later for him then. Other SNCC staffers have suggested that much of their issues involved power struggles. Smith, some have said, was the dominant partner, but Robinson really wanted to dominate her. At some point, Smith, however, and I'm still trying to figure out, are said to have realized the marriage that enabled Smith to pursue a life as wife, activist, and mother. And they remained married until her death in 1967. Not all African-American female civil rights leaders were able to find a balance, however. For example, when Diane Nash married James Bevel, she found that her leadership position was lost. According to one scholar, from that point on, the dynamic young woman who had led the Nashville sit-in and saved the freedom rides was eclipsed by her charismatic husband, who would soon join the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Nevertheless, Nash continued working in the movement. In May 1962, she was arrested for teaching high school students the techniques of nonviolence in Mississippi. She was tried and convicted for contributing to the delinquency of minors and sentenced to 2 years in jail. At this point in time, she was expecting her first child that was due any day now, and she refused bail and refused to appeal the conviction. She commented, "We in the nonviolent movement have been talking about jail without bail for 2 years or more. The time has come for us to mean what we say. Stop posting bond. This will be a black baby born in Mississippi, and thus whenever he is born, he will be in prison. I believe that if I go to jail now, it may help hasten the day when my child and all children will be free, not only on the day of their birth, but for all of their lives." Concerned about the optics, Nash was giving Nash giving birth in jail, Mississippi officials eventually released her. On August 5th, 1962, the Bevels welcomed their daughter, Sherry Lynn. 2 years later, they had a son, Douglas. In the late 1960s, the turn towards Black power not only altered the nature and direction of the Black freedom movement, but also the relationships of its leaders and members. I just found this photo, so I just wanted to share it. This is Fred Hampton doing a wedding ceremony in Chicago of 2 Black Panthers. It was in a private collection, and so I was able to get a copy of it, like on Saturday. So this was great. So I'm just beginning my exploration into Black power movement marriages. But I believe that these relationships were informed by Black power ideology and vice versa. Specifically, I'm finding that the party's rejection of the commoditization of intimate relationships under capital, meaning the ownership of one's lover or partner, made their members more agreeable to free love and experimenting with innovative approaches to gender relations and politics. Predictably, however, free love translated into different consequences for women than it did for men. And these consequences showcased how members also continued to hold patriarchal beliefs about sex, marriage, and parenting. So I briefly want to discuss 2 relationships that I'm currently researching. The marriage of Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver, and Huey Newton and his first wife, Gwen Fontaine. Here are 2 images of Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen Neal, who met at a SNCC conference held in Fisk University in the spring of 1967. At the time, Cleaver was the party's Minister of Information. He had gained much popular acclaim from his 1968 publication of Soul on Ice, a collection of his writings from prison on race, sex, and Black liberation in the United States. Cleaver, a convicted rapist, wrote frankly about raping Black women to refine his technique before moving on to, quote, white prey. Soul on Ice concluded with an extended allegory about the emasculation of Black men by slavery, the power of white men as, quote, the omnipotent administrators, and the, quote, ultra-feminine white woman. In this scenario, Black women are described as, quote, self-reliant Amazons. Surprisingly, however, Neal, who was a diplomat's daughter and at the time a SNCC activist before being recruited to the party, said that when she met Cleaver, she thought of him not as an ex-con or a rapist, she thought of him as a writer and activist. She has said, my connection to Eldridge had been through his writing. He was extremely well-read and intelligent. He knew and talked more and was smarter than all the college kids I knew. So I had been impressed intellectually. He said it was love at first sight. It was not love at first sight for me, because he was very big and tall and had no expression on his face. Now I understand that's how men who had been in prison a long time. They conceal their feelings for so long, they have this mask. He was physically imposing, but as I spent more time with him, he seemed very gentle. He was like a teenager in a certain sense, that he was just developing who he is. Emotionally, I was probably more mature than he was. In that sense, we probably were more compatible than most people would have thought. So he was pursuing me for 10 days and eventually got my attention. We got together, and I think right before I had to leave the conference, I was in love with him. After the conference was over in July, Neal went to go visit Cleaver in the Bay Area, and before the year's end, she had relocated to Oakland and married Eldridge. She had also become the party's communications secretary. Kathleen Cleaver's organizing experience in SNCC made her an invaluable resource for the crisis-ridden Panthers. She found the Panthers in a total state of collapse with no office, no newspaper, no meetings. She began to initiate fundraising activities for the Panthers and planned demonstrations to raise awareness about Newton's legal case. So by this point in time, by the time she gets there, Newton had been charged with killing a police officer, and so she's working on his behalf. She served as a contact person for the press about Panther-sponsored events. Cleaver would play a pivotal role as the first woman of the Panther Central Committee and become one of the most recognizable public faces of the Black Panther Party. Her legitimacy, like most of the women discussed here today, was not derived from her marriage to Eldridge Cleaver, but from the considerable array of skills and experiences she brought to the party. 4 months after their wedding, Eldridge was arrested following a shootout between the Black Panther Party and the Oakland police. Initially, he was released, but when he was ordered to return to court, the Cleavers fled the country. Over the next 6 years, they settled in Algeria, Cuba, and France. In 1971, the couple was expelled from the Panthers as a result of Eldridge and Huey Newton's disagreement over armed resistance and the group's ties to North Korea. Of this time, Kathleen has said, quote, "By the time I was 22, I was married. By the time I was 24, I'm in Algeria and pregnant. By the time I'm 25, I have 2 kids, and I am tired." Making matters worse was the domestic abuse that was an open secret in the party. Now, I won't describe some of the accounts of her domestic abuse. Elaine Brown does some of that work in her autobiography. But I do want to point out that the party had an interesting relationship with women, and I don't think it has sometimes been said that they were just blanketly misogynistic. That's an unfair, I would argue that's an unfair characterization. I think it's more complex than that. The party actually addressed domestic abuse in its organizational structure. Black Panther Party Chairman Bobby Seale explained that in response to men who were violent towards women, demanded sexual favors, or used verbal intimidation, the Panthers had initiated a dialogue on gender discrimination, enforced punishments, and adopted such rules as, quote, "Do not take liberties with women," one of the 8 points of attention that every Panther had to memorize. Nothing, however, appears to have been done about the Cleaver situation. When Elaine Brown goes to Algeria to visit the Cleavers, Kathleen had just given birth, and so she's very weak, and she's not doing very well, and so she's bedridden. And she says that Eldridge at that point in time started yelling and screaming at her for no reason, and he smacked her in the face. For Brown, she argues that it's this moment that she was thinking about inviting Eldridge back into the Panther Party, but seeing this incident that she chose not to. The Panthers' gender politics created a strong, empowered public Kathleen Cleaver and thrusted the victimized Cleaver into the realm of the private. This private realm was very much constructed. The intensity of the relationships built by the Black Panther Party members, the almost round-the-clock political work they engaged in, and their ideological commitment to the personal being political meant that there were very few aspects of members' lives that were truly unseen. In 1987, Eldridge and Kathleen divorced. By this time, the procedure was just a formality, ending what had become an unhappy, abusive union. Kathleen explained that they went off into 2 different directions. Quote, "He had a condition that I'd never heard of called manic depressive. I wanted to go back to college, so I was applying to colleges all over the East Coast, and I was accepted at Yale. Then I told him I was leaving. They had accepted me so quickly it was a transfer, so there wasn't any time to get a divorce. I had to pack up and leave within 3 months from the time that I accepted it. It was all very sudden for him, and he wasn't quite prepared for this. So I just packed up, took our kids, and moved. After I finished law school, I just filed for divorce. Our lives changed, the things that connected us changed. But we were married for 20 years, so I guess that's probably in American terms a pretty good record." So now let's turn briefly to Huey Newton and his first marriage with Gwen Fontaine. Huey Newton was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party and served as the Minister of Defense. Gwen joined the party in the winter of 1969 after her sister introduced her to the organization. At the time, Gwen had 2 young children from a previous marriage. I believe she had her second child by the time she was 15, and she divorced by the time she was 17. After the breakup of her marriage, she trained as a legal secretary, and upon becoming a member of the Black Panther Party, she became Newton's personal secretary. They married in 1977. Much of what's available about their union comes from Elaine Brown's autobiography, and I should say that Brown was a former lover of Newton, and so she's admittedly jealous, and so you have to somewhat read their marriage through her bias, right? Brown writes, "Gwen, quote, accepted Huey on a daily basis, which I knew was a chore. At best, she was a real woman. She was a woman and his woman. I, on the other hand, was a politico, a partner, a comrade, notable with pussy, which was sometimes relevant." At one point in time, Brown confronts Newton about, "Why did you marry Gwen, right? Why aren't you with me?" And he responded, quote, "I need a wife. Matter of fact, you need a wife. Think about it. If we both had wives, we could be lovers forever. The fact is, I need Gwen. She's good to me, better than I've been to myself." Much can be said about his response to sexual freedom, to open marriage, to the democratization, or arguably the ungendering of the role of wife, as he would later in the conversation refer to Larry Henson as Brown's wife because of his unwavering loyalty to Brown and the party. But given the time constraints, I want to focus on Brown's characterization of Gwen as a real woman and Newton's conceptualization of wife. Here, real woman and wife seem to be one and the same. For Brown and Newton, a wife was someone who accepted and did everything for their partner. Gwen, Brown describes, quote, stayed up long hours with him, filling requests for exotic food or sex. She hosted the men, the rough underground men and street partners who were coming more and more often from 1- and 2-day nightmares, bringing Huey cocaine and cognac like myrrh. She served lunches to the legions of white intellectuals and journalists who wanted to take note of the revolution of the dashing Huey P. Newton. She kept track of all the names, addresses, and faces of the rich and nearly rich who donated checks to the party in exchange for a few hours with Huey. She served tea or champagne to the other women, the ones brought in for the night. She maintained his daily life with grace and usually with a smile. When he fled to Havana after being charged with murdering a prostitute and assaulting his tailor, it's very dramatic. Gwen followed with her 2 children, who by this point in time Huey had adopted. She remained by his side until he returned to the United States and he stood trial for the aforementioned charges. But by 1982, Gwen could no longer accept and do everything for Huey, who was now heavily addicted to alcohol and drugs. She left Huey. 1 year later, they divorced. Both remarried, Gwen to a Chicago contractor and Newton to Frederica. Newton, as many of you might know, continued to decline after his marriage. On August 22nd, 1989, he was shot 3 times in the early hours of the morning near a crack house in Oakland. Newton's unseemly death fueled a chorus of conservative and former radicals who portrayed the party's entire operation as a front for criminal activity, obscured by a political posture that carried a whiff of fraudulence from the start. Former Panthers and sympathizers countered that the party's legacy was infinitely more complex and also positive. In the mid-20th century, black marriage rates were on a decline, a trend that began after the Second World War. The civil rights and black power movements generated important milestones in the history of racial justice and heightened expectations of black meritocracy, of achieving and overcoming racial wrongs, but they could not and did not reverse the racial disparity in marriage rates. These movements, however, did romantically unite people and also tore them apart. African American activists wrestled with the problem of balancing their social lives with their movement commitments, and as a result, the relationships they forged obeyed, tested, and broadened the boundaries of traditional marriage. Many black couples advanced functional modern marriages that radically challenged patriarchy and embraced gender egalitarianism and aspects of second-wave feminism. Others aspired to normative middle-class marriages, faithfully conforming to the tenets of gender normativity, and some tried to find a balance between the aforementioned. Whatever path they chose, these relationships informed the nature and direction of the black freedom struggle and reveal new aspects of black gender and sexuality, family, and activism in the late 20th century. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Traci, thanks. That was fascinating. Just a couple fact things. I don't want anybody to think Diane Nash was white.
Oh, no.
No, because you segue. I'm sure you made it
Yes.
clear, but I wanted to state that because you segue from her marriage to Bevel to interracial marriage.
Yes.
She is
Yes.
an African American. I had never seen her pictures from the movement.
Yeah.
But I interviewed her, as Cornell knows, for Many Rivers to Cross, with John Lewis at the Woolworth counters that are now in the Smithsonian, right? And when I walked in, and when John Lewis walked in and saw her, he blushed and she blushed. And he said, as you could see, this was the most beautiful woman in the United States. And I go, whoa, John, look at this. You know, John was a widower, recent widower at the time. But he was like a little boy, I mean, gushing. The the Cleavers, just a fact, never went to Cuba together. Eldridge went to Cuba.
Right.
Kathleen never went to Cuba.
That's right.
Kathleen meets up with him in Algiers. She's pregnant, but they named the boy Maceo after Antonio Maceo because he was one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution. And then from there they go to France and they're underground. I lived with them for 2 weeks when they were underground in Paris, and I interviewed both of them. And I published in various forms this interview. And I mean, I'm no expert on their relationship. The reason she came to Yale was because of me. I got her to apply to Yale.
That's big.
Well, I was a Yalie. I met them when I was a graduate student in Cambridge, and I was going to do this big expose of them living underground. But nobody was interested. Time Magazine wasn't interested, and I was sort of a stringer for Time Magazine. And then we were trying to buy Eldridge Cleaver's papers. This is all too, I'm getting in the weeds here. But the reason the Richard Wright papers are at Yale is that Ellen Wright was Eldridge Cleaver's agent. And I am dispatched, authorized by Charles Davis of Blaskane at the age of 22 to negotiate to get the Eldridge Cleaver papers. And then Blaskane jumps on a plane and flies over to Paris to meet them. So when I'm talking to Ellen Wright about Eldridge's papers, I just happened out of the blue to ask her where her husband's papers were. And I thought she was going to say the Library of Congress or something. And she just pointed, we were in her house, and she went like that, in the basement.
Wow.
So I immediately called Charles Davis, and Yale ended up, immediately buying those papers for $350,000, which at the time was a hell of a lot of money. So she came to Yale because I encouraged her to come to apply. I didn't have anything to do with her getting in, but she got in, and then she graduated summa cum laude from Yale, and then from Yale Law School. Eldridge would come back and forth to visit. They lived up on, where's the Divinity School? Up in New Haven? Yeah, there's graduate apartments across the street, Prospect Street. And he would come back and forth. And it was clear that their marriage was falling apart. She talked about how he had been abusive. And then later, when I really got to know her after, Eldridge is in the meantime flipping out and becoming a born-again Christian, doing all that stuff. She talked a lot more openly about it. And curiously, as a footnote, Maceo became an Orthodox Muslim, lived in Saudi Arabia, I think had 4 wives or 3, and many children. And then in December of last year, he was coming back. He had become an expert on beekeeping. And he was coming back to Atlanta, where Kathleen and Joju, or the daughter who was born in North Korea, lived. And he dropped dead. He just dropped dead one day.
Of what?
Just, the Widowmaker, I guess.
Wow.
And now Kathleen has dementia.
Yeah, I heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and one of the last public events she did, my 45th reunion from Yale, we were the class that went on, we led the strike in New Haven for Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins. But Bobby Seale had never been invited back because it was all so traumatic. So 2 years ago, or whenever it was, I organized Bobby and Kathleen coming back to Yale for our 45th reunion, and the two of us were on stage with a white guy representing the administration at that time. And they had, fabulous conversation about all this stuff. I don't know about Elaine Brown's authority and what she saw in Algiers. Eldridge is perfectly capable of smacking Kathleen around, which he did all the time. But all I know is that Kathleen and Eldridge hated Elaine Brown.
Yes.
So I just want to say, it may have happened, it may not. God only knows, because what was happening between Huey and Eldridge on the phone between Oakland and Algiers was enormously complicated and all that. Anyway, all that was just meant to be a long footnote, and I'll defer now to Cornel West.
Just such a
both brilliant and courageous piece, because I think you're really on delicate territory. But it's territory we need to be on. Your subtlety is a way of allowing us to walk these kind of tight ropes once you get into lived experience of people's own private lives and so forth. But I have a question about two towering figures. The greatest literary artist who emerged out of SNCC, who's Alice Walker, who wrote that novel, Meridian.
Yes.
I'd love to hear what you got to say. And the greatest prophetic activist, Marian Wright Edelman, who's still very much on emerging out of that same matrix, as it were, and how they were able to walk through all of these subtleties and sustain the unbelievable levels of commitment and conviction in the struggle for freedom.
Yeah, I think Alice Walker is testament to a lot of African American women in the movement, right? That SNCC is complicated. I think there's this story that, Stokely Carmichael comes up, says, the only good reason for women, I'm paraphrasing, is the only position that women should have in SNCC is prone, right? Which was meant as a joke. I mean, and I think what I read is that all the women laughed at the time. But I think this is also, they just figured out how to navigate. They were leaders in that movement, but they also understood sort of the gender politics. They also understood when to get out, because by the end of SNCC, it's mostly the men standing, and these women have gone on, many of whom, Alice Walker has started the womanist movement, several others have joined black feminist movements and started their own organizations. And I think for them, SNCC was a key training ground for what their future work would look like. Yeah. I don't know as much about Alice Walker's romantic life as I would like, but the tricky part of this project is getting people to tell you about their romances and their marriage. She did. That's right. But the tricky part about marriage, as I'm finding out even in my own, is that you could have two different ideas about where you are in a marriage. And so to try to figure out how to meld those stories together and be respectful to the people that you're talking about, many of whom are still living, is a challenge. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah.
Hi, Traci.
Hi.
So I wonder if you've looked at marriage in other social movements, like maybe the Boricua Power movement or feminist movement, or other types of social conflict, like maybe marriage during World War II or Vietnam, and how that might compare to marriage during the Black Civil Rights Movement. Yeah. And then the second question is, so you focus a lot on the leadership of the Black social movement, right? Black Civil Rights Movement. But I wonder if you could maybe say how you might expect for marriage to also look like among the lower rungs of the Civil Rights Movement, whether you would anticipate to find similar dynamics.
So I've begun looking at marriage more broadly. And so right now I've been focused on the literature on Black marriages. And I've done a lot of reading on marriages during World War II, World War I, and I think those actually map on quite well, because to be in the Civil Rights Movement is to be in a state of war. And I think if we think about it that way, it works out really well. And I keep coming back to, this is why I keep using this language of like, they're in war, it's battlegrounds, they're living in close proximity. It's just a co-ed proximity, unlike if you're with your soldiers, which is typically all men. So I'm trying to figure out what that looks like in the 20th century. And part because then I'm trying to figure out what to do with also the fact that marriage is on a rapid decline in the Black community in the 20th century, which people have attributed to different things, from deindustrialization to the fact that the movement never fully undermined or undid racial capitalism. So I'm not quite sure. But as for the people on the ground, I start at the top because it's the low-hanging fruit in a way. Those people have been interviewed numerous times. I can pick out a lot of the good information. And as Skip mentioned, Kathleen has dementia now, so there's some folks that I just want to get to first. For the people on the ground, I really don't know. I have to imagine that I don't know. I mean, this is why I keep coming back to my husband's parents, because these are the people on the ground. I mean, he spent a lot of time in the early days of marriage running guns between Chicago and Rockford. And they would take sometimes these trips in the car out to California. It's a different type of, and we're talking about two people who were not college graduates. They had a little bit of college education, so I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like. And they don't have a story where they end up going off to law school and college. They have a story where they end up working 9-to-5 jobs, struggling to put their son through private school in the middle of a crime-ridden, gang-banging Chicago in the 1980s and 90s, right? So I don't know, yeah.
I just wanted to amplify the question or the comment concerning Alice Walker and ask if, because you're using memoir and biography and history, if you had any plans to read her work, because she was quite obsessed with this question, but of course she's writing fiction.
Yes.
So the question concerns the relationship between fiction and reality in your work.
I think so. I mean, I do African American studies. I'm trained as a historian, but I do African American studies, which means that you have to pull from a variety of sources in order to get at what people are talking about. What Alice Walker is talking about, and I think another good example is Nina Simone. She's got a song called Go Limp, where it's a conversation between a mother and a daughter about when you go down south, keep your legs closed, basically, right? And she finally gets down south and she's met these SNCC men and she just can't keep her promise to her mother. There is something, right, there's something there. There's a story being told that people might not be willing to put their name on it. But I think she's speaking to I think they're both speaking to a larger trend in the movement.
So thank you for your talk. I'm thanking you in particular because you helped me to understand a story that I heard many years ago, like 5-6 years ago. I didn't get it, but now I finally got it. When I moved here in 2013, I had the opportunity of living, I want to share this story and ask you a question, of living with a historian, political activist called Gwendolyn Middlehall. And she was married, I lived with her for 7 months while I was getting used to this country. She literally helped me with everything at the beginning. And while I was living with her, she told me the story of when she was married with Harry Haywood, the communist activist, the author of Black Bolshevik. And I'm saying this because your presentation actually helped me to understand many of the stories she told me at that point, how civil rights movement and political movement are mixed with personal relationships and violence in marriage and all, many other stories. And I also wanted to ask you, what are the sources? Because I see you have many sources. You have pictures, you have diaries, you have books, you have, I'm guessing also oral history, right?
I have oral histories.
So yeah, what are these sources that you're using? And if you're using oral histories, Gwendolyn Middlehall, she's still alive and pretty active. She's 91. And in case that you want to,
thank you.
I can get you in touch with her, and she'll be really happy.
that.
She's writing her autobiography,
Yeah.
which partially tells the story of her marriage with Harry Haywood. They had to go to New York to get married in 1956. So yeah, what are the sources that?
So it's a lot of oral history right now, because what I'm trying to do is get both sides of the marriage, not just one. I know that it's going to require a lot of, I've been sitting through Jet and Ebony magazine a lot, because these are the big black publications at the time, and Jet sort of is really good about keeping track of people, but they're not long articles. I've been using music to get at, there's another section that I'm writing about pregnancy within the movement. I've been using some music. I've been trying to keep like a really wide net about what I can use. Because some of these people don't want to talk. Some of these people can no longer talk. And so I want to be able to get at it from multiple angles.
Excuse me, if I were you, let me suggest the obvious.
Yeah.
I'd make a list from oldest to the youngest,
I have, yeah.
and also the children, and I would just get on that.
Yeah.
Right away. I mean, I could connect you to Joju,
Oh, that
who's a very good friend of mine.
Yeah.
And she'll talk to you about her parents' relationship.
Thank you.
And John Lewis, we could get you in there, and Diane. You know, I would just boom, 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 do it.
Yeah.
Jet and Ebony, not exactly
No.
the most reliable sources for what was actually happening, right? But, I mean, they are a kind of calendar.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly is a great way to chart the perception of things
Yeah.
with it, quote unquote, within the Black community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at Jet and Ebony because of how they're looking at marriage. I mean, there's a point where they do this article about, I think, Roy Wilkins and his wife, and they talk about, she's just such a good woman. She stays at home all day while he's out there fighting. Look at her. She's a strong, and we know that story is way more complicated. And then by the time we get to, I think it's right after the Moynihan report, Ebony decides to have an article on black women and for newlywed wives and say, your job is now to hold up your man and let go of all your independence. And so I think while I'm less concerned about how the outside world is perceiving black marriage, right? I want to know the inside, the nitty gritty. I think that that story also sort of overlaps, and I really want to, I want to be able to speak to that.
We're all at home in America watching Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, and, you know, what shows are showing women, white women, working
That's right.
at the
That's
same
right.
time, right? They're at home and dressed to kill when the guy comes home to dinner and all the meals set out.
Yeah.
Shit, I wanted to live in a house like that too. Anyway, go ahead.
Hey, way
Traci,
back
thanks
here.
so much for your presentation. I am really curious about how you're going to develop further the idea of egalitarianism,
Yeah.
right? Because it was a term that you used at the beginning of the presentation. And then as I was hearing some of the dynamics that you were laying out for us in these marriages, I wondered, you know, would both parties understand these marriages, these relationships to be egalitarian, right? So what exactly would that mean in terms of domestic labor, in terms of intellectual knowledge and recognition? And so your thoughts as to sort of where that's leading up to for some of the couples that you mentioned, but others perhaps that you didn't, in terms of how are they understanding egalitarianism?
Yeah, so I think the best example would be going back to Ruby Doris Smith and her husband. Because she was so involved in SNCC and she was outside the home so often, he took on more of the parenting role and took on more of the domestic role. And for her, what I'm gathering is that was egalitarianism for them, right? And so I think you're right. I need to be able to define it according to each couple. Or maybe just drop the word altogether. But I agree.
I think I'm finally up. I wonder, echo exactly what Professor West said about this dangerous, treacherous, brave, and much needed work about how important it is and how risky it is. And I want to thank you for taking those risks and doing this work. So my question is, so we know very much about the very pointed FBI involvement in trying to destabilize Martin Luther King's marriage. So my question is about what do we know about COINTELPRO and police surveillance, and how whether there were systematic attempts to, you know, intervene in these relationships, but also just to, you know, just cause chaos by via rumor, innuendo, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know so much about, at least when it comes to marriages. I do know that COINTELPRO, the investigation, especially in the Panther movement, took a toll on many of the couples. And several of them speak to that directly about the stress that it took and how it affected the men versus the women differently, that allowed women to sort of rise to power. I've seen that argument being made. It's a good question about, I've been reluctant to go look at the FBI records because we know that they're faulty. I mean, they're just, a lot of that stuff is lies. And so, I mean, I will have to contend with it, but I just, Yeah, I think I don't want to be biased first. Does that make sense? Yeah. Krishna.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to go back to a question, your answer, in fact, to a question Danilo had asked regarding the project, the way it is conceived, regarding the focus on, your discussion of marriage. Today, as we heard, it's mostly the leaders, right? And I think if I recall correctly, your answer was about how to consider non-leaders, like the people without stories, technically, who don't become law professors and they're at Yale and so on and so forth. So my question is, how are you thinking about the book itself? Because I think the way you outlined it, you are getting to contemporary stuff and looking at the breakdown of the black family, quote unquote.
Well, I wouldn't say,
so
I
what-
wouldn't argue that there was a breakdown of the black
No, I'm
family.
not saying
Okay,
you are
yeah.
arguing. I'm not saying you are arguing, actually. And, just a term I threw out there. But I'm wondering how you are conceiving of kind of whether you are thinking of going beyond these leaders in other chapters, other section of the book.
Oh yeah, so this is the thing. My first book, I ended up I tell the story of these people that no one's ever heard of, right? Like people's aunt and uncles that I just happen to find out as I'm going along. That's the work of actually doing the oral histories, is when I start to talk to other people who are like, oh, you should talk to this person. I think it'll actually be the stories of the unnamed, the unknown, the ordinary people, right? Those will probably be more exciting to me. And I think they might be richer in explaining some of the economic dimensions of I think it'll get to other aspects of the movement, not simply this personal romantic marriage, but also perhaps focus more on the economic dimensions of the civil rights movement, which has been slightly overlooked to some degree. So I don't, but yeah.
A couple of things. One, I had a couple of days of conversation with Diane Nash, and one of the things that she said to me was, the first thing I remember saying to her was, she told me how long they had been married. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize you guys have been married that long. And her answer was, I shouldn't have stayed married to him that long. But one of the things that struck me about the conversation with her was she did feel that the celebrity and the celebrity, the visibility, and the fact that they were in leadership was a complicating variable. And so I want to just underscore what he was saying about, and what Jorge's saying about whether, how much is that affecting the outcome of these relationships as much as the regular, everyday, ordinary activists.
Yeah.
Because I think that those relationships are different. Even if you if you go into the Black Power movement, deeper into the Black Power movement, those relationships are different. You can, and the people are around, and you can talk to them. So I'm just kind of curious, do you feel that there is a frame, which is what I think Martine is saying, is there a frame that you're leaning towards that's going to help you to narrow the broadness?
No, I would say no. And I'll say that because I guess my method is to go get as much as possible and then see.
So you're not there, you're not at the narrowing.
I'm at the hunt and gather phase of this project. Yes.
Traci, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Dee. I'm a Loeb Fellow here, but I'm originally from St. Louis and was an arts organizer during the uprising that happened in Ferguson 5 years ago. And what I appreciate about your presentation is that a lot of the issues that you brought up from the civil rights movement and the Black Panther movement are things that we experienced on the ground in 2014 and 2015. Especially in regards of interracial relationships, in regards of witnessing people who we knew were abusing their spouses, and grappling with that, and that led to a lot of infighting. That led to a lot of us parsing out from the whole group and focusing on being queer or being women. And my question for you is, do you see space in your book, or just, in your opinion at large, about how we grapple with these issues in order to have healthier dynamics and movements that may come in the future?
So it's funny because I've been trying to figure out what to do with that, because I have a lot of students who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement, or their chapter, who are part of their chapter, the local young NAACP that they're now having some infighting with. I don't know. I imagine that there will be lessons that can be learned, as there always is historically, but I don't know the answer. And I'm also willing to admit by the end of the book, if I don't have the answer, I don't have the answer. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting conversation. What I find, and this is why I try to stay somewhat close to my students, because it's that information that I wouldn't know ordinarily, right? It's their infighting that sometimes it seems like it could be dismissed as petty arguments, right? It could be dismissed as gossip, but there is something there that I do believe it maps on. Like there's some continuities that I have to really grapple with. Yeah.
Two things. Having been involved in 63, 64, 65, with SNCC, with CORE, and looking back on what I felt, a great deal of tension, a great question of relationships, and something is happening right now, the coming together of people that had broken off relations, whites and blacks, by 1965. This is a picture which you can hold up. Stoughton Lind on the left, Bob Zellner next to him, a figure from the peace movement, and Alice Walker. People are coming together after not being together.
Yeah.
And a lot of hard feelings, and a lot of, I don't even know how to react to it. I ran away. I went abroad. And I came back and I couldn't let go of it, and I've been writing. I think you've got to continue making contact and getting people to talk before it's too late.
Yeah. I mean, the nice part is that the 50th anniversary of SNCC is this spring, so I will be there with recorders and notebooks, very ready to talk to people.
Traci, thank you for this really wonderful presentation. I'm just learning so much. So one of the things that I was thinking about, and it sort of resonates with a question Danilo made, was sociologists. So I have this training a little bit in social movements theory and perspective. And one of the things that's interesting is that there's a sort of general problem that the couples, whose relationships you detail here experience, which is social movements under conditions of war, as you might call it, tend to rely on really tight networks, right? And marriage is a greedy institution, as sociologists of gender and marriage talk about. And so there's an inherent difficulty of establishing privacy and boundaries within tightly knit social movements like that. But nevertheless, I guess the question that connects to Danilo's question is this sort of intersectional challenge of what it means to have love when you're activists in this situation. So Danilo asked about what relationships and love looks like, for example, comparatively, and I assume Danilo meant the white feminist movement, right? And then, sort of under conditions of war. But of course, the situation is that this is a civil war, right? It's not like 1945 war where, everybody in the nation is, I don't need to explain. But anyway, so I find it interesting that your work offers an opportunity to kind of think about, from an intersectional perspective, what kinds of love is possible when you're fighting a war on multiple fronts, obviously the racial front within civil society, and then also the gender front. So yeah, I just thought it was really interesting. And as a small biographical note, or random personal note, my husband's great aunt is Marvel Cook. So she, Marvel Jackson Cook, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so she was the first paramour of Roy Wilkins, and they decided that it wouldn't work out because of ideological reasons and sort of gender dynamics and such. So anyway, it's just interesting also to think about, like Black women leaders and feminists, and what kinds of possibilities were available to them for love and marriage formation. She eventually married a Jamaican footballer, so yeah. So there you go. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you for this really brilliant project that you're doing. This work needs to be done. I'm glad that you were doing it. I had a couple of questions about what do we do about Black queer folks outside of marriage and those kind of intimacies. Black queer folks outside of institutions of marriage in this period. And, what does that teach us about the problematics of marriage and respectability, and as you pointed out, the heteronormativity of marriage that even Black men and women are struggling with because it's completely limiting based on the kind of new reality that they want to create. Yet they're still stuck to this institution with its really limiting gender roles and imagination of privacy in the public and the domestic sphere and reproductive politics and who can lead, who needs to follow. Additionally, I'm really curious about sex and desire and how you're going to get at those kind of intimacies that are not about necessarily how we manage the children or things like this. But I'm very interested, for example, I loved when you said, we're talking about the sexualized racism that's inherent to Jim Crow, that's inherent to the racial state, right? This is something that's been really important in my work, is talking about the centrality of sex to that question. And the ways in which Black men approach it are, in this kind of ability to mobilize Black male hypersexuality in ways that benefit them, but yet Black women are hamstrung by the politics of respectability and can't take those risks. So I'm very interested in that question of how respectability figures in the possibilities for sexual agency and different kinds of queer desires that are possible in this moment.
So I don't, so I've been grappling with how to get at it, particularly with Black women, right? I think there is a cultural dissemblance, right, that we know of, that there's a lot of secrecy when it comes to people's relationships because it protects them. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I've been reading material on Black women and their sexuality, and I keep coming across more and more about these conversations about Black women not being able to embrace sex and find pleasure in sex, and that they're just now doing it now in the 21st century. Like, there's just,
that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. So I don't know. I mean, this is where I'm gonna have to be a very good interviewer. And, yeah, I mean, that's the best way I can get at it. The idea of queer folk, however, I didn't present it today, but I've been doing a lot of, I started looking at in the lives of Robert Powell and Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was really open with his relationships on the front lines. He didn't see it as a moral dilemma. He didn't even think his arrest should be hidden. Rodney Powell, on the other hand, though, ended up marrying a civil rights activist. He actually wanted to get with Diane Nash, as most of them did. That's right. He wanted to get with Diane Nash, and James Bevel, he found out, went behind his back and outed him to Diane. He ends up marrying another woman, and they stay married for a very long time, and he admits that he's gay at some point in their marriage, and they still stay married for another couple of years. He's now, once he left and moved to Hawaii, and it was in Hawaii that he was able to really embrace his queerness, and he's now married. And then he became very active in the gay liberation movement. So I think I feel like there's something that can be said about the lines between these movements actually not being as hard and fast as we'd like to imagine them to be. Yeah.
But I just think that this magnificent revival of the intellectual genius and giant Lorraine Hansberry.
Yes.
When you read her stuff in The One, which is the gay thing,
Yes.
or The Ladder, which is the lesbian
Yes.
magazine, and her private papers, while she's married to Brother Nemiroff.
That's right.
Another Jewish brother has his own career. He's writing music. They have cash. They living up in upstate New York. All of these issues was they have a marriage where they agree that the sexuality will flow outside of the marriage, but they remain as close as they can be.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jewel the same way, who's the wife of Nemiroff after Lorraine dies in that regard. So that, and she writes the text for the movement.
Yeah.
You remember the wonderful text that she, so this is another possibility of
Yes.
ways in which it flows outside. And then when Baldwin's private papers come out,
That's when I'm. Yeah.
oh Lord, it's a whole new day. That Negro genius and what's going on in his life.
Yeah.
He's there in 1957.
Yeah.
Well, I won't, go into it. That's a whole new. So what you doing is magnificent, though.
It is.
But I also find it interesting that interracial marriage for black women could also be a form of protection.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think Lorraine Hansberry is an excellent example.
That's
Diane Carroll's an example. There's ways in which interracial marriage functions differently. I mean, that's the only way that's the other way of getting at it.
But it's also enabling because you see,
Yes.
as an intellectual, I mean, her second play, the sign in Sidney Brewstein's window was no black folk at all.
That's right.
It's about New York intellectuals.
Right.
But it enables her intellectual genius to flow, but ain't that much happening on the sexual front.
Right.
Hey, that's life.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't get everything. That's true in life. You love your mama, but you ain't talking about Nietzsche with mama. You know what I mean? So she's working it out, not just for protection, but an enabling that allow all of what she is to be manifest with all the contradictions, all the tensions, and all the magnificent joys and pleasures.
The Nemiroffs
Wow.
asked me to write the introduction to her collected writings that came out. I think finally Spike did it. Remember in the early 90s?
Yes, yes, yes.
And I said I could only do it if I addressed her sexuality.
All right.
And they told me to kiss off.
Mm.
They said they did not think, they were polite about it, but firm.
Yeah,
They said
yeah.
they saw, they approached me as a literary critic, they said. And they saw no reason why, they thought that would be purient. But I wanted to ask you, we're out of time.
But it's like Arnold trying to write Langston Hughes' biography, and they don't want to talk about his sexuality.
Right, which is...
He can't get to it, and he's got to make an agreement not to get to it. We got to tell the truth about the complexity of the humanity of black folk, given all of our magnificence and our...
I mean, it's sort of like the scandal about Malcolm X as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and
With
Manning,
Bruce's book.
and Manning...
That's right. Yeah.
Right, that's exactly right.
But
That's exactly
we're
right.
out of time. But Cornell, why did you ask her about Meridian? Was there anything specifically in Meridian that you were trying to get her to focus on? And before you answer that, because we really are out of time, just to go from Julia to Foxy Brown, in terms of representation of the sexuality of black women, you might also want to think about what was happening about black sexuality in popular culture.
Thank you.
Yeah, because Foxy Brown that is an amazing representation of a black woman's sexuality.
Yeah.
Julia that is the politics of respectability.
Absolutely, yeah.
But anyway, Cordell, about Meridian.
I mean, one is just as a literary artist, the same kind of courage that we're talking about, the same kind of wrestling with the fears, anxieties, and insecurities that go hand in hand with any kind of personal relation, that she plunges into the regional and the interracial dynamics from a black woman's normative gaze. And this is, what year did that, though? Brother Kim, that's about 19...
Seven.
No, not that early, though, brother. Yeah. 7-0? The same year as Tony's Bluest Eye?
Yeah, it's why it's a miracle year.
Oh, yeah. That's true. Okay, I didn't realize it was that early.
The Bluest Eye, Tony Kaye, Meridian, and I Know Why the King's Birds Sing are
All came out the same year.
Wow.
Whoa, and you see, that's fresh on her mind. And if it's 1970,
Yeah.
I don't think it's that early, though, man. 76. 76. Because I know when I read it, I was not in high school. 1970, I'm still playing basketball in high school. What year was it?
76.
76, so Skip. No, but I mean, that's... No, but I mean, but the issue of the relation between the art and historical reality, and as a historian, that's always a challenge.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's always a challenge. But you're doing just a marvelous job in working this through. And it's something that is so important because I think, there's 1,052 pages on Lorraine Hansberry.
Yes.
Of the FBI. There's only one black writer who has more, 1,800 pages, that's Baldwin. You see. And so that there's something in those files, even though they're lying, their perception of what is going on in terms of her intellectual, personal, political, ideological life is still, I think, a useful interlocutor, even given the suspicions that you have. But we do salute you. We salute you.
Let's thank Traci for...
Thank you.